Clearly we need longer breaks. It's a pleasure for me to introduce the moderator of our third panel, Professor Daniel Sargent, a professor at UC Berkeley with appointments in both the Department of History and the Goldman School of Public Policy. He is the co-director of the Institute of International Studies, which just has so much wonderful programming on this campus, and an executive committee member of the Berkeley Initiative for Free Inquiry. His research focuses on U.S. foreign relations, the history of international order, and the evolution of American global leadership since World War II. He earned his BA from Cambridge and his MA and PhD in history from Harvard. Welcome, Professor Sargent.
Thank you, Chris. I thought I'd just start out this panel with a personal anecdote. So in the late summer of 2023, I did an interview with the New York Times on academic freedom on this campus. In the course of that interview, I managed to describe mandatory DEI statements as an exercise in performative dishonesty. I got a lot of notes after that interview was published in the Times, some of which expressed concern for my professional welfare. And I can report now that in the subsequent academic year, I was elected by my faculty colleagues to serve on the Divisional Council of the Academic Senate for Berkeley, which suggests either that my colleagues have more tolerance for intellectual heterodoxy than I had assumed, or a really exquisite aptitude for coercion and punishment. But it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce our final panel, which is tasked with moving from diagnosis towards prognosis and even prescription. How can universities regain public legitimacy, navigate our entrenched partisan polarization, and reassert their core values in the public sphere? This is a weighty assignment for our panel to undertake, and we have just over an hour and 10 minutes in which to accomplish it. What I'm going to do is ask our panelists to consider one core question. Why is trust in universities broken, and how can we restore it? I'm mindful that this is our last session, and I would like to be able to engage the audience as much as possible. So I'm going to ask everyone to be succinct, and I'm going to cede much of my own time as panel chair to pose questions to you, the audience. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I will ask them to reflect upon our core question: why is trust in universities broken, and how can we restore it? And their opening presentations will be the foundation for a discussion that I hope will engage many of you. So without any further ado, let me turn to introduce our panelists, which I will do in alphabetical order. First, we have Daniel Diermeier, who is joining us via Zoom from Nashville, where he is Chancellor of Vanderbilt University. A prominent advocate for open discourse and free expression in higher education, he has formerly held faculty and leadership roles at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Business, and the University of Chicago's Harris School. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Guggenheim Foundation. Next, joining us in person, we have Alice Dreger, a historian, journalist, and writer well known for her work on identity, ethics, and science. She is a prominent commentator on academic freedom and scientific inquiry, and formerly served as a professor at Northwestern University. She is the author of Galileo's Middle Finger and has served on the advisory council of the Heterodox Academy, which named her in 2024 its managing editor. Finally, we have Brian Rosenberg, who is President Emeritus of Macalester College and presently a visiting professor at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. He is a scholar of 19th century English literature and a leading voice on higher education leadership, civic engagement, and the liberal arts. His recent work has directly explored the question of how colleges can navigate political polarization and adapt to challenges of institutional change. I'm going to ask our participants to contribute in alphabetical order, the sequence in which I have introduced them. Then we will build this into a conversation. Chancellor Diermeier, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Daniel, for the kind introduction. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I hope you can see me okay and hear me okay. I'm gonna give you a little bit of report from the battle lines here, because obviously this is the most profound and most threatening situation, and where universities have found themselves in a long, long time, certainly in my lifetime. And obviously there are many battlegrounds on that. We have everything from lawsuits, we have executive orders, we have severe threats with respect to funding cuts, doubts about the future of NIN and NIH and NSF funding, the endowment tax, all of that. And while we need to fight these fires one fire at a time, I think it's very important for us to understand what is really the root cause of this, what's going on here. And what is, setting aside all the politics of the Trump administration and how that works, we have seen an erosion of trust in America's universities really for a decade now, with catastrophic numbers in the last couple of years. So we've seen, if you think about this as public approval rating measured in a whole variety of different ways by different polls, they have been declining across the board, both by Democrats and by Republicans. The drop in trust in public support among Republicans is catastrophic. It's basically now 25 to 30%, depending on how you count, of Republicans have basically a positive point of view about America's great universities. It's very, very difficult, even if we're able to deal with the various threats and challenges that are happening right now, to maintain the long-term future of America's great universities. And I'm speaking particularly about the great research universities of this country, if we're losing half the population. So what are the core concerns or core drivers of that? They're not the same, but they're also things that are the same. So from the left, the main concern is really about inequality. So to somewhat say it maybe a little bit more pointed than it deserves, but people from the left look at university as inequality machines, that they are basically perpetuating inequality through a whole variety of mechanisms. That's the main concern. People on the right think we're woke factories. And it's just very important to understand how deep this goes now. So I spend a lot of time in Washington now. And when you talk to people in Congress, staffers, members of the administration, particularly those on the conservative side, the loathing of particularly the Ivies is really bottomless. And it's visceral, and it is very difficult to be able to argue for the benefit and the value of research universities, given where we are in terms of like the reputation, particularly of the Ivies, but it's certainly broader than that. Then everybody believes that we're unaffordable. That's certainly true for private universities, and that we're not well run, so that we're inefficient and waste money. That's pretty universal. My sense is that the issue on inequality is largely overblown. It's more like a perception problem than reality. I know I'm in the minority on that, but I'm happy to go there. Just to give an example, the level of financial aid that we, for example, are providing is I think it's impressive. And just to make it concrete, for families that make less than $150,000, if you go to Vanderbilt, you go for free, and that's true for as many of our peers. We work extremely hard to make sure that our students come from all sorts of backgrounds. We have like 24% of first-gen students now. So when people accuse us of being an oligarchy, we're probably the only oligarchy in history that's actively trying to become more accessible for people that are not part of it. So I think that is largely a communications problem. There are issues, of course, with legacy admissions and things like that, but they're minor, I think. And so I think that is, I don't think that's the biggest concern, the biggest driver. A much bigger concern, I think, is what we're seeing now from the right, and that is concerns over political bias, ideological capture, monocultures, lack of viewpoint diversity. There are different ways to talk about this. They all have a different flavor, but they all basically say that universities have lost or deviated from their core research mission and have become, at least in some cases, advocates for one side of the political spectrum. That manifests itself in different ways. I mean, Daniel, I think you mentioned this in the DEI context with like diversity statements, for example. Of course, you have talked about this already, and there's an important consideration. Heterodox Academy, of course, played an important role. The second component, which is on the second component, things like free speech, institutional neutrality, free expression, those type of concerns and restriction as such. So DEI, free speech, institutional neutrality is the second component. And then the third one, not to be underestimated, is the sense that there's ideological capture of core disciplines. And I think the way this manifested itself dramatically so, was really after October 7th, of course, with many of the statements that were made by professional associations accusing Israel of genocide and so forth. The move of the AUP towards, if not endorsing, then certainly tolerating academic boycotts. And then there's just kind of the anecdotal experience that I and many others have. I've had a little bit of a kind of more public role on that. And so people walk over to me now at conferences and events. They're not academics, but they're parents. And they say, look, my daughter wanted to study history, was really looking forward to that. And then she's looking at the level of course catalog, and it's basically the only flavor available is to talk about a view of American history as deeply rooted as a racist enterprise from its beginning. And I'm just like stunned by this. So you hear similar things about other disciplines, but the reason why this is important is that the perception that these people have, and the way they express it, is that we have an intellectual homogeneity there. We've lost our way, that we've become more politicized. And the people that express that are not radicals on the political spectrum, but are perfectly mainstream, reasonable people, for whom the main touch point with a university like ours is either through the admissions process, which is very stressful, or then when they follow what their sons and daughters are doing when they're actually taking those classes. So I've been active on these concerns. My main recommendation for faculty and university leaders is to be crystal clear about what their mission is, that the mission is defined by seeking knowledge and transmitting it, that universities must get out of the political position taking business, and do so with intent and in a public way that makes it clear to everybody that we understand what our core mission is and act accordingly. And then secondly, we must be much, much, much better to demonstrate the value of our research to the American public. That's largely a communication problem, and I'm happy to go into the details on that as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's turn now to Alice Dreger.
Thank you. I'm not usually second in alphabetical order, so that was a great beginning for our conversation. Thank you. So I work at Heterodox Academy, and for those of you who are not familiar with us, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that basically holds these conversations nationally and locally all the time. We work on protecting and promoting open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement in higher ed. And it is true that we get marked as being right of center, but I'll tell you, at Heterodox Academy, we work really hard to aim for principles on a nonpartisan basis. I'm somebody who's easily identified as left of center, and there's a reason I work there, which is I passionately believe in the mission that we have. And I hope a lot of you will choose to join us. Membership is free, and it comes with a lot of benefits. So as we think about this problem, I'm coming at it partly as a former academic, partly as somebody who worked on cancel culture, documenting what happened to people who were canceled, and then partly also because I ended up accidentally running a newspaper for 10 years after I left academia. I created a successful local newspaper in East Lansing, Michigan, and so I had to actually do that work. And part of what I want us to think about is the other places where trust has been lost and what we can learn from those other places. And the media, journalism, is of course one of the other big institutions in America that's incredibly important for knowledge seeking and important for our democratic system, where trust has also been lost enormously. One of the main things I want you to understand from looking at what's happened in the media, looking at what's happened in academia, is that I think trust is built locally and lost nationally. So if we want to understand why trust has been lost, we can look at a lot of national conversations and see the places where we've sort of fallen down. But if we look at where trust gets built, it really happens at the local level. And that's going to be something we'll have to understand as individual campuses in terms of how we can begin to build back. If we build back trust locally, we begin to build trust back nationally. And the same thing is happening in journalistic systems, where we find that building back systems of local news encourages people to understand journalism, and as a consequence, they begin to become less cynical about journalism at the national level. But part of what we also have to understand is that we're in, of course, a social media environment, and much as in academia we might like to not pay too much attention to that other than for entertainment, the fact is, as Jaron Lanier has really well documented and other people who study social media have documented, social media is set up according to algorithms that are aimed at the lizard brain. And basically what will keep you engaged, which is the main goal of social media because engagement equals money, what will keep you engaged is things that make you upset, things that make you anxious, and things that make you angry. And so when we think about why people are anxious, upset, and angry at universities or at the media, part of what we have to think about is the way we're existing within that environment. And that's very difficult. Academic life doesn't fit well on social media except to become debased. The kinds of work we normally do is thoughtful, long-term. Social media is not generally something that's going to help us build back trust. So we have to find other methods for doing that. And I want to talk now about where are those places where we can grab onto and try to build back trust locally in order to build it back nationally. I think one of the places we need to pay attention to is teaching. We have still an academic system which heavily values research and does not value teaching to a great extent. We give it a lot of lip service, but not enough attention. Nicole Barbera-Samofsky, who is our Director of Communications at Heterodox Academy, has a piece coming out in the next issue of Inquisitive magazine, which I edit for Heterodox Academy, talking about bans on classrooms and why they're so bad, where ideas are being banned from classrooms. But she makes the really important point that if we want to fight back against idea bans in classrooms, we have to take teaching seriously as a profession. And we don't do that. I got no training in my career as a graduate student, nor did most of you, in teaching, even though most of us were expected to go on and have teaching careers. Can you imagine if doctors were treated the same way? If basically we taught them to be investigators and then sent them into clinics? That would be a very bizarre thing to do, but we continue to do that, not take teaching seriously. Murray Sperber years ago in his great book, Beer and Circus, had a great line that I thought, it just explains so much of what goes on in the academy. He said, faculty and students have a mutual non-aggression pact. The understanding is we won't push you to learn and you don't push us to teach. And I'm afraid that describes a lot of where we are. Another place we can really push, I think, is on the issue of class. The fourth issue of Inquisitive will actually be on class, so I'm currently reading the new book by Richard Kallenberg, Class Matters, The Fight to Get Beyond Race Preferences, Reduce Inequality, and Build Real Diversity at American Colleges. And I think if we're going to start to grapple with the problem of the people who really think universities are terrible places, we have to face the fact that that's a lot of working class people, that a lot of the people who support Trump's policies are people who have been excluded from university systems. Kallenberg really maps out really data-based smart ways that we can begin to actually address the problem of lower income folks not getting access to universities and colleges. And I can't go into depth on that because of lack of time. Related to that, I think we have to begin to address the crisis of young men. We have a national problem, it's actually an international problem, where young men are being diverted away from successful lives, where they're not making it to college, and we know what effect that has on their economic futures and on their well-being. And so we need to begin to address that. And in Michigan, actually, Governor Gretchen Whitmer has a new initiative to try to get more men into colleges and try to get gender equity in the colleges so that we don't have a situation where 60% of undergraduates are women and 40% are men. Also trying to get them into the trades for the same reason, to get into successful careers. I don't know how to do this in a situation where we're told we're not supposed to talk about gender. I think we should talk about gender, and we have to talk about the crisis of young men. Additionally, I think we have to, as many speakers here have mentioned, take seriously the issue of outreach. Evan Morris, who's a HXA member at Yale University, sent me a piece he's working on where he talked about it's time to change the dictum from publish or perish to public or perish, that we have to be public in the work that we're doing. And Mark McNeely, another HXA member at UNC Chapel Hill in the business school, sent a great list of the kinds of reforms we can do internal to our universities to begin to build back trust. And obviously talking about those will help with that. It's things you would expect: affirming free expression and academic freedom, protecting against identity-based harassment, having a commitment to viewpoint diversity that's meaningful and actually trying to get diverse viewpoints into the academy, promoting constructive dialogue and civil discourse, adopting policies of institutional neutrality so that universities don't speak on political issues except when it's directly tied to their missions, reinforcing due process and fair procedures and things like Title IX. The other context I think we have to recognize, thank you, is the context of nihilism. We're at a point in our history where the problem of trying to explain to people why it's important that there are people seeking the truth is a problem where people don't even believe truth is attainable, where truth is not a real thing. In the situation where you have deep fakes, people become understandably of the opinion that truth is not really something that is real or attainable. So that's where humility can help us. But I think in our outreach, we really need to begin to get to a basic thing, which is epistemology. We need to actually take epistemology to the streets and begin at a very basic level to explain to people how we ascertain knowledge, to try to combat the nihilism of the attitude that there is no knowledge to be sought and that nobody is any smarter than anybody else, any more knowledgeable. That's going to be a big project and will take, I think, all of us actually getting into places outside of our universities. I learned very much from doing the newspaper that I was working on that the only way to build local trust was actually to get out into and among the people. So we brought the newspaper to community centers. We went to bars and restaurants. We went to synagogues and the Islamic Center and religious organizations and actually talked with them about epistemology of journalism. How is it we know what we know? How do we figure out what we don't know? And how do we ascertain sources? And we educated an entire community on how journalism works. And what did they tell me? They started actually paying into national journalistic systems because they understood for the first time why reporting takes money. We have to explain to people why being a university takes money, why the search for knowledge requires resources like cash. And just on that point, I'll point you finally to one op-ed that I really kind of blew my mind in the New York Times by M. Gesson. It was a piece called "This is How the University Can Escape Trump's Trap If They Dare." And the argument that author was making was that the most radical thing we can do is actually just keep teaching and just keep researching even if the money disappears. In other words, go out into the community and do teaching and do it in a humble, knowledgeable fashion, so that we show people what teaching is, what education is, and what the search for knowledge is. And I think that idea is something that is really powerful, the idea that we sort of, if the universities are going to be undone, let's undo them ourselves and go back to the basics of showing people why the pursuit of knowledge is something that is so vitally important to human life. Thank you.
Thank you.
So is it okay for me to just say what she said? Thank you for that. Greetings from Cambridge, where all is peaceful and quiet. One of the challenges of speaking at the end of a session like this is it's hard to not repeat some of what other people have said. I'll try not to do too much of that. In responding to the question about why there's been a loss of public trust in higher education and what we can do about it, I want to begin with three qualifications. The first is that I think it is not worth spending a lot of time trying to persuade the current federal administration in the value of higher education. I will confess I am someone who does believe it is an authoritarian project. And I say that because higher education, of course, is not the only area that is under attack. So is the press, so is the legal system. And those are the three areas that are typically the areas that authoritarian projects try first to go after. So I do think it is critical for us to regain public trust. I think we are fighting the wrong battle if we try to persuade the current federal administration in the value of what we're doing. The second qualification that I would like to make is, and someone said this in a question earlier, is that we have to remind ourselves that colleges and universities are embedded in a larger society. And much of what we're seeing in higher education is a reflection of social and economic trends that go far beyond the university. And I would highlight in particular something that someone highlighted earlier, and that's growing economic and social inequality. You can track from about 1980 the growing divide in wealth in this country, and it is being concentrated in a smaller and smaller group of people. We have seen dramatic changes in the global economy that have changed the nature of work. And so the loss of faith in higher education is part of a larger loss of faith in institutions. We are not the only institution that has seen a dramatic decline in public trust. And we're not even the worst. So it is not to excuse us from responsibility. I think a lot of the responsibility does sit with us. But we do have to remember that there are larger factors here, social, economic, that over which we have very little control. And that makes our work a little bit more challenging. And I always feel like I have to say this at gatherings of this kind. I'm not going to embarrass people by asking for a show of hands, but usually when I'm at gatherings of this kind and someone asks, who here did not get a degree from an elite institution? Virtually no one raises their hand. And we have to remember that elite institutions are not American higher education. 8 million students attend community colleges. And the vast majority of institutions in this country are not selective. They're not worried about who to exclude. They're not worried about affirmative action because it's irrelevant. They're trying to fill their seats. And so it's really, really important when we talk about public trust to distinguish between the elites and everybody else. Generally, what I have found in speaking at a lot of institutions, traveling around the country, people feel just fine about their local community college. The people in Alma, Michigan feel just fine about Alma College, the small liberal arts college in their town, because it's the largest employer. As do the people in Roanoke, Virginia about Roanoke College, and as do the people in Tulsa, Oklahoma about the University of Tulsa. And so to your point about the local, it really, really is important for us to distinguish between the elite institutions and everybody else. And what we're really talking about is a reputational problem for the elites. The reason that is a sector-wide problem is because for far too many people, the elites represent American higher education. There are more references in a year in the New York Times and the Washington Post to Harvard University, which enrolls 25,000 students, than to all community colleges, which enroll 8 million. And so that's where a lot of people get their sense of higher education. So what can we do about it? I'm not going to focus as much as others have on political polarization because a lot of that has been said, a lot of it has been right. I agree with some, I don't agree with some. I want to focus on some other things. The first thing I'll focus on is cost. The comprehensive fee at Wellesley College is now over $100,000 a year. And yes, we give lots of financial aid, but the fact remains that the policies by which financial aid are awarded to most people who are in the public are about as opaque as the policies of airlines. Why does one ticket cost more than another ticket? Our policies are incomprehensible to most people. And they look at those numbers, they look at that price, and they say, why do you cost so much? And it generates a lot of resentment that has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with economics and affordability. We have to stop affirmative action for rich kids. So I respectfully disagree with Chancellor Diermeier, who, by the way, I think is one of the most articulate spokespeople in the country for academic freedom. But I don't think the question of access and inequality is a small one. At Harvard University, half the students pay full tuition. That is, at the richest university in the country, half of the student body can afford to pay effectively $500,000 for their college education. There are more students at elite universities from the top 1% of the economic distribution than from the bottom 2 quartiles. That's in my view, that is not trivial. And the fact is that at every elite institution in the country, regardless of how wealthy they are, you have a major leg up if you are wealthy. And that generates enormous resentment of the elites. Again, it is not true of the vast majority of colleges, which essentially admit everybody, but there's no excuse for institutions like Harvard, with an endowment of $50 billion, to populate half their undergraduate class with very, very wealthy students. So if we want to end affirmative action, then I would also end affirmative action for wealthy students. And then to reiterate this point about the local, higher education has been very good at looking inward. It has been, especially at the elite level, not very good at looking outward. You ask most people around Harvard who are not associated with Harvard about it, and they don't feel very good about it. You ask people in Alston what they think about Harvard, they're the ones who came in and took over our entire city and built expensive restaurants and expensive apartment buildings. Elite universities, by and large, have not done a good job of connecting with local communities and of outreach rather than thinking about self-interest. And then finally, because I just have a minute left, I will say that people look at us and say, you guys cannot change. You are the most change-resistant industry in the United States and maybe the world. Higher education has been described as a conservative industry populated by progressive people. People in higher education are very progressive when it comes to their politics. They're deeply conservative when it comes to their own institutions. And I'll finish by referencing the point, Alice's point about teaching. We talk a lot about the teaching function at these institutions, yet we create incentive systems that prioritize research. You don't get tenure at Harvard if you're a good teacher. You get tenure at Harvard if you're a stellar researcher. And so our messaging about educating students falls flat because it is not reflected in our reward system, and people notice that. So we should change that as well. And I agree, and I have written about the fact that it is unconscionable that as a graduate student at Columbia University, I never received a moment of instruction about teaching. And that has been my profession. I spent the next 15 years as a teacher, and I was never trained. My wife is just retired as a clinical physician. Could you imagine if she had never been trained in seeing patients? Well, I was never trained in how to teach students, and there's something fundamentally wrong about that. Thank you.
Great. I'd like to thank all three of our panelists for enormously provocative, interesting opening presentations. We have so much substance here to work with. I really don't know where to begin. So I think I might try to pick up what seems like the most challenging point that was put on the table during the opening presentations, which was Alice's suggestion that we need to grapple hard with what you called, Alice, the culture of nihilism that increasingly envelops and captivates our society. It's a point that, of course, recalls Christopher Lasch's famous book from the late 1970s. It also, as I listened to you, couldn't help but recall for me Jesus's conversation with Pontius Pilate, as recounted in the book of John, in which Pilate asks Christ, very famously, "What is truth?" And it seems that Pilate's outlook is the one that we increasingly echo in our 21st century contemporary society. And that's a reality that creates enormous challenges for universities as institutions so ostensibly dedicated to the pursuit of truth that many of us put the word truth in its Latin form, veritas, in our mottos. So the question that I want to ask each of you is, how do we reaffirm our commitment to truth? Is it by doubling down on the integrity of what we do, by affirming louder and louder that universities are not indoctrination factories, but truth factories? Or might we consider an alternative approach, perhaps to relinquish our grips on the truth somewhat, and to acknowledge the provisionality of the knowledge claims that so many of us make in our work? Do we need to be more articulate in making the distinction between hypothesis and truth, more willing to acknowledge that the ultimate truthfulness of the inquiry that so many of us do is exceedingly difficult to ascertain, even with the most rigorous research methodologies? So I'm curious about how you think we should approach this most fundamental of questions.
Well, this is actually somewhere where I think we find real value in the humanities and the social sciences, because they are places where we can really engage students with these issues and engage the public with these issues of how knowledge has changed over time, how different cultures have developed different knowledge systems, and begin to really engage with them in the idea of how do we figure out what's real and what's not real. It's so often the case that when we teach and when we speak to the public, we speak as if everything is settled. Again, if we taught people how to teach, then there would be a possibility of teaching our educators how to teach epistemology of their disciplines, the question of how do we know what we know. And that just doesn't happen at the moment. When I became an assistant professor at Michigan State University a million years ago, I was actually, because I was in an undergraduate teaching unit, I was actually encouraged to take workshops on teaching, and we had outstanding people at that university who were educators of education. And I took those courses, and I began finally to learn how to actually teach my students the idea of thinking and how to engage them with the excitement of thinking. And, shortly after taking that, I won seven years worth of students' favorite teacher of the year thing, best teacher of the year. And I think it was entirely because what I was doing was trying very hard to teach them how exciting their brains were. How often do we really do that? How often do we talk with our students instead of telling them what is the truth and what they need to reiterate to us on a test? How often do we engage them in the question of their minds and excite them about their minds? And the same thing with the public. I think it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And this is another area, I think, where to some extent we have to look in the mirror. And I speak as someone who is, as a humanist, who has a PhD in English and went into the study of literature because I was interested in reading works of great importance. And as I moved through the early stages of my career, what I increasingly began to hear was things like everything's a text. And there's no difference between reading Dickens and reading the phone book. They're both texts. And I've even seen articles that debate whether Trump's post-truth world is a kind of postmodernist world. And so I think to some extent we would really benefit by getting back to a world where we acknowledge that there were certain works of art, of literature, of music that represent the best that were produced by the best minds and hearts of their period, and exposing students to that. I'm on the board of the Teagle Foundation. One of the programs that we have that has been most successful is a program in which we introduce students to transformative texts. And these are not students who are majoring in humanities. This originated at Columbia, at Purdue, and it operates under the belief that every student not just will benefit from, but every student actually, if sufficiently inspired, wants to encounter these texts. And so I really do think we need to return to the notion that, aesthetics matter and quality matters. And I think we have to acknowledge the fact that in the humanities, to some extent, we have given that up.
I'll say I think this is a super interesting discussion, and I thought both of these I think are important directions. I love this sense of like being much more intentional about like about the great books and the great text and how to think about them, and to engage seriously with epistemology. And anybody who has ever taken a class in philosophy of science knows how tricky it is to actually articulate it and to understand the subtleties in being able to talk about this in in an intelligent and reflective way. So I think these are important, and I think many of the things that were said before about these larger forces, whether it's social media that's undermining that or the challenges of inequality. I think what we should not forget with these bigger concerns is like we're in a dogfight right now. I mean, we're in a dogfight for the future of the research universities in this country, and we should with all the context that's important, I think should not forget what do we do now in order to have a fighting chance so that these phenomenal institutions that have grown over hundreds of years and are the greatest universities that the world has ever seen survive and thrive. And I think there are two key components on that. One component is that we must be able to articulate much simpler the great work that's happening at our universities. And look, if we have concerns over the teaching quality and access, that's all. I think these are good concerns. But let's not forget the phenomenal work that's happening in our labs and in our research facilities every day. The tremendous breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs, clinical work, technological work, innovation that came out of universities, and all of that is at stake right now. So it's utterly critical that we're able to explain this to people in our communities. I love the term "trust is built locally and lost nationally," to elected representatives. It's not necessarily about convincing them that they were wrong, but it's letting them know about things that they just don't know or don't appreciate. How many of the core technologies that we're taking for granted had their origins in university, and how absolutely critical the universities are for any type of biomedical breakthrough that has happened over the last few years and will happen in the future. So I think that's number one. And then the second piece is, which talks a little bit about the epistemological questions, is we got to be scrupulously focused on our core mission. And that is about the creation of knowledge and its transmission. So it's about research and teaching. And any hint that we're deviating from that as an institution is really, I think has caused tremendous damage to the standing of universities in the last few years. So those are the two things I think we have to do. We have to be clearly articulate what our mission is, why it is beneficial for the public, and do this in a way that's easy to understand so that we don't get lost in the subtleties. We're all academics and we love subtleties and we love distinction, we love complexities and we love big questions. But right now, the key is to be simple, to talk in a way that can be understood by everybody and connected to the type of concerns that everyday people have. That, I think, is the task of the moment.
Can I just?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and one thing we can do in that regard is to engage the public with the question of what questions we should be researching. And we don't do this very often, which is frustrating. So my spouse is the dean of the medical school at Michigan State, and he has a public health program in Flint, Michigan. And one of the things they've done there is have a community advisory board actually help articulate what questions the public health group will actually study in Flint. When you do that kind of work, people actually feel like you care about their lives. So we can say, we've discovered this and we've developed this technology and all these kinds of things, and you'll see these things in your lives. But the more we can actually honestly engage the public in the question of what we should be doing, the more I think we will not be seen as elite and not be seen as separated and be part of the same community. I also think it's incredibly important as we go out there and talk about our work that we be honest that sometimes it doesn't lead to anything. That sometimes millions of dollars are spent futilely because we were trying to figure something out and it didn't work. When I talk about going out there and doing epistemology, I don't just mean we sell the things that worked. I mean, we actually have to be honest about how hard knowledge seeking is, so that people understand why universities are such special places. In the same way that if you educate them about the way journalism really works, they understand how incredibly difficult it is to bring a piece of investigative journalism that is accurate and compelling and didn't miss key important parts. That kind of transparency allows people to feel like they know how the world operates, and that gives them a sense of safety. And that's the kind of thing that I think we are lacking, is that sort of communication of the ways in which universities are safety nets for humankind.
Great. As I mentioned at the beginning, I would like to cede the preponderance of my time as moderator to you, the audience, so please feel free to pose questions. But I'm just going to ask one more question to give you time to formulate your questions. The word humility is not a word that one intuitively associates with elite American universities. But as I listen to this conversation, I wonder if humility is in fact the H word around which we should today be rallying. And I'd be grateful for your reflections and responses.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one thing you don't see a lot of at Harvard is humility. I will attest to that, and I think that is really problematic. It doesn't matter what sphere you're in. People don't like to feel looked down on, and for one reason or another. A lot of elite institutions, and not just through their attitudes, but through their actions. I'm a graduate, and my PhD is from Columbia. And, Columbia has engendered enormous bad feelings in Upper Manhattan because of its expansion into that area and its gentrification and its dramatic changes in the neighborhood. That's more than attitudinal lack of humility. That is lack of humility in action. And NYU tried to do the same thing in Lower Manhattan, and they got more pushback, and so they stopped. So I do think, not just in the way that we talk about ourselves, but in the actions that these very, very wealthy elite institutions take, they need to show more respect for the communities by which they are surrounded. And I think that will generate a different set of attitudes towards those institutions.
Yeah, I'm not sure humility is the virtue, but I can think about what the vices are. And I think that's like things like arrogance, complacency, self-deception, contempt. That needs to go. These things need to go. And people need to understand I think we need to understand two aspects here. Number one is, why are we organized the way we are? Why do we do the things we are? Why is this the right thing to do? And then right now, since so much of the debate is about academic freedom and funding by the taxpayer for the type of research or the type of student support that is crucial for us to do what we want to do, what we're doing day to day, that trust needs to be re-earned. That cannot be taken for granted. We need to actively be able to communicate in a clear and understandable fashion for why is it that we deserve this support, and why is it that we should be these type of special places where people can pursue their interests freely and without restrictions, because at the end of the day, it generates great things. Now we have to believe that. I believe that. I have zero problem with leading an elite university, and I think the work that we're doing is phenomenal, both for our student outcomes and for the research outcomes that we produce. But that doesn't mean we can't improve. So we can't be complacent on that. And that doesn't mean that we could just take for granted the support that we're getting, whether it's from the local community or from the taxpayer for the type of work that we're doing. That needs to be, it's utterly clear that people do not understand that. They have doubts whether we deserve it. And we have to be able to articulate this in a convincing fashion. And if we're not able to do that, maybe other people can do it for us more effectively. So in the biomedical side, that may be patients, that may be businesses that benefit from innovation. That's a form of humility, I think, maybe, but I think it's just realistic in the current environment.
Great. Thank you. Let me take questions now from the audience.
Research replicability and integrity in research. I'm wondering if the three of you or the four of you agree that that's a pretty important issue now, and what are 2 or 3 concrete steps that we could take to address those issues?
Yeah, no, research integrity is definitely one of the ways where we whittle away at public trust, right? If we spend hundreds of millions of dollars on an Alzheimer line of study that we know isn't working or has been misrepresented, then we end up eroding away public trust. But how you deal with that is obviously a difficult problem. I do think that one of the things we have to keep in mind as we talk about viewpoint diversity is that it's not as simple as correcting problems by adding conservative voices, although that is important. We also have to think about the ways in which science narrows itself, or knowledge, various disciplines narrow themselves and become echo chambers because the people doing the hiring are hiring people they already agree with. So one of the things I think might help us all would be to change the way that we do hiring, to open it up more to people in other disciplines, as weird as that sounds, who might actually be able to look into our discipline and say, you know, you all already do all of this, and this person seems to do something really interesting. Why aren't you considering that person? Our faculty hiring system is very strange, right? Basically, people who already agree with each other are hiring the next person. The odds of you hiring somebody that you tend to agree with will be pretty high. So I think faculty hiring systems are one of the ways that we can address things. The other way we can start to address the problem, Rod, we had a really good piece in the first issue of Inquisitive about this, the ways in which at the national level you have specific topics being targeted as the only kinds of things that will really get funding. And I'm not talking about DEI. I'm talking about things like the belief that Alzheimer's has to be caused by this particular thing, or the belief that we're not going to study behavioral psychology because drug psychology is the way to solve everything, or genetic psychology, to look at genetics and not to look at environmental concerns. The ways that our sciences and our knowledge keep getting narrowed, I think those are the places where we have to sort of picket it. And if we begin to do that, we will, I think, have more robust systems that hopefully will help prevent the kinds of problems that we have. That alone won't do it. I mean, I'm a fan of places like Retraction Watch that actually do marry journalism to the pursuit of knowledge in academia and looks very carefully at where the problems are and outs it transparently. The more we can out transparently those kinds of problems, the better off we'll be.
I mean, I think they're like, first of all, we got to fix this. I mean, this is like super important, and it undermines further, I think, the trust in universities and really in science more generally. My sense is there's some very specific tactical things that already are happening to a certain extent, but should be broadened. So when you think about replicability, there's like all sorts of things. There's plagiarism. There is there's fraud. There's sloppiness, there's kind of, T-value hacking. I mean, all sorts of things they're just different manifestations and different level of severity, of course. But things where, I know this from my own discipline. It's like, you in many areas, you have to submit their data, or you have to submit your code, and they're going to run the thing before your paper is even considered for publication. So I think things like that, rewards for publications that challenge certain studies and replicate them, I would call them kind of tactical things. We really need to experiment with that. That's hugely important. What's interesting to me is, why do we see more of that right now? And I think in part because there's much more value for the kind of celebrity scientist or the celebrity academic now than we had before. Interesting story for why that is. I think there's in part because there has been great success for these kind of popularization of science books, both by academics and outside. And the kind of celebrity academic in the world of social media, of course, has more of a platform. So the incentives, I think, have been changing there to a certain extent. And I think the technologies that we've had, whether it's through peer review, the way promotion and tenure is structured, to come back to something Alice just said a second ago, we kind of need to tighten that up and look for new approaches to make sure that we're keeping up with what seems clearly to be the case of more severe problems than we've had in the past.
Great, thank you. Our next question.
I'm from UC Davis, Joseph Bielo, Math Department. Dovetailing that notion of humility and tying something that various speakers and one of the questions came up with, the crisis of men in college, or just of young men, the 60-40 split, the fact that we have the most number of students at university, or fraction of the population at least, in the history of the United States. The fact that every speaker keeps talking about what we are as a university, but what you're really referring to is what we were as a university, right? Who we are serving now. Abby pointed out, I was the head advisor of the math department at UC Davis for years. Abby pointed out that we have so many remedial classes right now. The population we are serving is very, very different. Now, what does this set the stage for? And when I talk about humility, we in this room speak of the university as an obvious good. Everybody's trying to say, how do we argue for the university? And in many ways, our research mission, I believe it's good, right? But parents and students and young people interact with the university through, I know this right now, my daughter's going through it, tuition, admissions, job, okay? And if you tie these things together, the narrative I see is that we have become bloated as an institution, not just any individual university, as the requiring people to succeed, okay, that they are required to come through this system. We all see this. I see my students not wanting to be there, okay? I try to be a dynamic lecturer. Yes, I've been 25 years in this business, okay? I'm not saying I'm great, but we all see this, at least at the public universities. They want to be through the process. They don't want to be in the process. And I think we need to look at ourselves, because those who've been selected to order the process, us as faculty, we are mostly very different than the students that are coming through. And I don't think we are humble enough to realize that maybe we have become too big. We, as all of the institutions together. And I wish maybe in the context of everything, Alice, you've talked about, and everybody else, can you say something about this? I'm sorry I polemicized, but I think there's a narrative that has to be woven together to understand this.
So it's a great question with a complicated set of answers. On the question of too big, I think it's really a great question. I've gotten to know the CFO at Harvard, and so nothing's confidential, but she's shown me the finances. Harvard University is basically a medical system with a university attached. That is the biggest source of both revenue and expense at Harvard University is the healthcare system. And if you think about some place like Harvard, which isn't even among the larger universities in the country, it's trying to do literally dozens of different things, some of which may be compatible with others and some are not. I walked into a restaurant the other day, and on the corner it said, owned by Harvard Real Estate Corp. Mm-hmm. That's the same university where I teach my classes. And so I do think we have to ask the question of whether these places have become so big and so varied in their enterprises that they are unable to perform any of them at a sufficiently high level. At another very fundamental level, in terms of students not wanting to be there, not wanting to get through, I really do think we have to acknowledge that we just have not been willing as an industry to look carefully at what we do and adopt best practices. And I'll give you a very concrete example. Eric Mazur, a physicist at Harvard, has been both arguing and demonstrating for 3 decades that learning science through doing is dramatically more effective than learning science through sitting in a lecture hall. And he's not the only one. He's characterized lecturing as, and this is very similar to your quote, it gives the teacher the illusion of teaching and the student the illusion of learning. He can't convince his own colleagues to adopt the methodologies that he has demonstrated work. And so is it any wonder if we are not adopting in our own classrooms the methodologies that have been proven to be most effective? Can we blame our students for checking out or for not learning as much as they might? If we all talk in our mission statements about wanting to transform. Every mission statement has the word transform, transformative, transformational. What about ourselves? We can't talk about transforming our students unless we're willing to really think seriously about transforming ourselves. People who have adopted some of the things we know about teaching and learning don't have a problem keeping their students interested. And so, we have to take that seriously. And then to the last quick point, we have defined excellence in elite higher education on the basis of whom we exclude. And I think that's a real problem. I've been doing work for the last 5 years at a startup university in Rwanda, which defines excellence on the basis of how many it includes. The work of educating a less prepared student is no less noble than the work of taking a student from the Dalton School who has perfect SAT scores and educating that student. And the fact that a university like Stanford, which admits 3% of its students, still produces expensive admissions material, you talk about a waste of money. Why? So that you can go from 3% to 2%? So, I think we need to begin by being honest about ourselves. And humble about ourselves if we really want people to take us more seriously.
Yeah, I do totally agree. Like, evidence-based teaching would be the revolution we need, right? If we did evidence-based teaching, we could take back the trust. We really could. We would completely engage people, not just in our classrooms, but publicly. One of the things you said reminded me that when I was resigning my position at Northwestern because my dean censored some work that we had published, the university was busy becoming a real estate conglomerate, and it was taking over so much space in downtown Chicago and Streeterville that they were sort of having to push the various businesses that were occupying all the university spaces. And there were signs up that, I'm not kidding you, said "Shop and Dine Northwestern." And one of the things I said in my resignation letter was, I did not get a PhD in history and philosophy of science in order to shop and dine Northwestern. If we can, to the question that was asked, legitimize the gap year, I think we could get a long way also. If we did not expect everybody to be ready for college at the age of 18, that might help. I was actually a college dropout. I was very high in my graduating class, second in my graduating class, went to Georgetown University, was bored out of my mind because of terrible teaching, dropped out, became a mortgage broker for 5 years, ended up going to a community college to finish my degree. And it was so much better because the faculty there were actually there to teach. And it totally changed my life, and I became an academic because of those people.
I'm so much more optimistic about the university and so much more positive. And so I'll try to give a little counter position or like a counter view on that. I mean, look, a lot of the things that you point out, I think are they're right, but I don't think they're as fundamental. So so the fact that let's take the problem. I'll give you two examples of that. One, let's take a problem of access, and if we take by the way, all of this stuff is the best work on this is by Raj Chetty at Harvard, who has been studying this for a long time. And there's a lot of focus on specific aspects of it. But here's one thing that he shows. If we take, and I'll just do this in the case of an anecdote. So we have a residential college system which is expensive to run. And I always, when the students are welcomed there, I walk around and say hello. And I walked into this one room, and there was the son of a billionaire, who I kind of remember from my Chicago days, and then at Vanderbilt, from the University of Chicago days. And then there was another young man standing there, and they had a T-shirt of the Posse Foundation. And if you don't know the Posse Foundation, it's one of the wonderful support, both financial support and overall support that help students from first generation, very underprivileged backgrounds to first of all to be accepted to university and thrive there. And we were one of the founding members decades ago. And I know the following: if they go together now, and they're gonna learn a lot, and I will not back away from that. I think we do a great job at educating our students, at least at our university. And when they both graduate, they will have the same expected lifetime income, irrespective of the background where they come from. That is an amazing thing that universities do. Now, it is true that getting in is difficult, and getting in is skewed towards families with higher income. But inequality doesn't start at 18 in an educational system. And it's just the case that if you go to a school that can spend $50,000 per year, and if you want to learn Spanish, you spend the summer in Madrid, you're gonna have a leg up over the kid that doesn't do that. And I speak from experience here because I was the first of my family to graduate from high school. But that cannot be put at the doorstep of universities. I think I don't think that's appropriate. And I think that the challenges that we have are much more systemic. So I would argue that conditional on where we are in the education and social system, we're doing an amazing job at providing opportunities for students that otherwise wouldn't have had them. And actually reshuffling opportunity, at least among our graduates. Now, should we educate more? Should we look at exactly who we're admitting and under what circumstances? Perfectly fair. But we spend so much time and so much effort to make these transformative, I used the word that was used before, education, accessible for students from inner cities, from rural communities that otherwise wouldn't have it. So I don't share the doom and gloom, at least not for the universities that I'm familiar with, which was, most University of Chicago and Vanderbilt now in administration. I don't share that. I think we're doing an amazing job in creating life opportunities for our students. And then the second thing I think is, it's like, should we have, so I went to a university with 80,000 students where you have to sit on the floor. That was in Munich, where you sit on the floor, and a kind of like a study section had 150. And you know what? If you don't have the support, student affairs, career service, you're just gonna drop out. And we have to ask ourselves, and people may not like that answer, and they may disagree with that. Is, do we want to have universities where we provide the best possible education and environment that we can think of? And I'm all open for learning sciences. I'm all open for looking at that. Do we want that? And to me, this is the same question: is, do we want to have a world-class symphony orchestra? And if you do, you're going to have to select the players that play at a certain level, and they have to play with each other as a high level, because otherwise they don't develop. That is true in music, that's true in athletics, and that's true in academics as well. You cannot have somebody who is, since we had a math professor there before, who is operating at a very high level in mathematics or physics or something, if they're not surrounded with students of similar ability. We know that everybody knows it from their day-to-day life. And the question is, do we want universities that do that or not? And if we do, then we need to be focused on their mission. We need to be willing to reinvent and question our practices. Could not agree more. But the fundamental question is, do you want that or not? And if you want that, and if you think that's important for society, then it's not about transforming or changing it, but having more of them and providing more opportunity. So I'm probably in the minority on these positions, but I think the work that these much maligned elite universities are doing, particularly for low-income students, is phenomenal, and they're creating opportunities that they could not get in any other system.
Great. I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, and apologies, but I'm going to take the priority of asking the last question. It's a question for you, Chancellor. We have a very large and growing group of managers and professionals on the UC Berkeley campus, and I think this is probably true at other UCs as well. This is an issue that Professor Brent brought up at the beginning. And on one hand, having a lot of staff makes sense to me because we're a service institution and we need a lot of staff to support our work. On the other hand, a theme we've seen emerge over and over today is a feeling that the senior managers are perpetuating some of the pathologies we're worried about. And I wanted to ask you as a chancellor, how could we better supervise this category of employee? As someone involved in the Senate, my job is to look at academic governance, and unfortunately, these people are outside the scope of academic governance, but they seem to be constantly threatening our academic governance.
Yeah, I think this is a very valid concern. I think it's sometimes called kind of the secret curriculum. This is the type of thing that's happening outside of the classroom. Look, the role of the faculty and the educational point of view of the university has to be absolutely central, and everything else needs to support that. And if we're not doing that, we're not doing our job. And that a lot of that requires us to be, I think, clear and explicit about what our point of view are on the specific educational values, and then really make sure that they are uniformly applied across the university, including at the staff function. Like student life probably is the most problematic along those lines. That must be true, and you can't tolerate that. It's just that simple. I mean, if these things kind of go rogue, they have to be aligned with our educational mission. Now, there are a couple of complicating factors that one just needs to keep in mind. They're not an excuse, because I think the concern is valid. But the regulations for universities, if you just look at the number of pages over the last 10 years, have increased by about 200%, a little under 200%. That's anything from lab safety to questions about transparency of research funding. There's a huge amount of that, of course, in mental health, Title IX, and. So 10 years ago, my predecessor, Nick Zappos, did a study together with President Kerman from Maryland, where the very detailed study, National Academy of Sciences had a follow-up on that, where we estimate that 11% of our expenses are spent on compliance with the regulatory environment. So I think that's we got to look at that, and every new government that comes in adds another requirement on that. It's not optimal. There's no doubt about that. It's overly complicated, overly bureaucratic. So I think that's the bottom line is we get that fixed, and then we need to have, it's really the role of leadership in universities to make sure that their resources are allocated appropriately, and we don't have this runaway kind of bureaucracy that is basically pursuing their own mission. That's not easy. There's no kind of silver bullet on that. That's kind of like, it's like you have to do it regularly. The boat takes on water every year, but it's absolutely essential that the educational mission is driven by the faculty, and that is what is fundamental to the educational experience of the students, not what's happening in support functions.
Great. Thank you. This panel, I'm afraid, is at time. Our penultimate task is to thank our three panelists for a terrific discussion.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It was wonderful to be part of it. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. But I love the question and I love the exchange.
Thank you. And our final task is to introduce Abigail Thompson, who will be providing some concluding remarks for this morning's conference.
Very brief concluding remarks, I promise. It's been a great conversation. I'd like to mention one topic that's been touched on glancingly throughout the morning, and that's the mission of the university. And I think one reason that it's been so glancing is because my guess is that most people in this room agree about what the mission of the university is. That is, it's the pursuit of truth and the dissemination of those truths that we find to our students. But I don't think that agreement is universal among university faculty and certainly university administrators. I believe that a substantial portion of the faculty and probably even a larger portion of the administrators believe that the mission of the university is social justice and the pursuit of social justice and turning students into activists for the pursuit of social justice. And we really need to reaffirm and make sure that everyone is on the same page with respect to what that mission is, because it's very different. We have a department on campus that says to major in this field is to major in social justice. We don't seem to have any mechanism for fixing ideologically captured segments of our university. We need to reestablish this, the core mission. This is the second conference on the contentious topic of the future of the university that I've been to in the last year. And sadly, it's the second conference on the future of the university that I've been to in the last 10 years, because it hasn't been talked about. And having the kind of free-wheeling discussion where people disagree a lot is very refreshing, and I really appreciate it. I'm grateful for that. A small group subgroup of this meeting will be meeting this afternoon to try to synthesize and to write down some of the things that we've been hearing about this morning. And finally, I just think we should give another thank you. First of all, thanks to all of the participants. Another thank you to the panelists, and especially to the organizers, particularly for Smritri. So thanks, and enjoy your lunch.